Hey everyone, Mr. Klein here, and let me adjust me a little bit. Talking about part two of our lecture over Andrew Jackson and kind of the things that he did well and the things that he's known for as being a villain. We've kind of talked about the election in 1824, how he didn't win. Then 1828 he does because of the expansion of voting rights, which comes in with the Jacksonian democracy. And we finished up talking in the first part about sectionalism and the idea of the North, South, and the West. And so this leads into what we're talking about here, which is the Tariff of Abominations. So the Tariff of Abominations is where the North, they wanted a higher tariff to boost U.S. manufacturing. So we talked about earlier how tariffs were a tax on imported goods in order to make sure that the stuff that is being manufactured within the country has better competition against imported goods, because imported goods seem to be cheaper sometimes than that. So the North wanted that because they are the big manufacturers in the United States. So they wanted to have that tariff on those things. In 1827, Congress does pass higher tariffs on imports. And so you see a lot of Northern people very happy about that. However, you see Southerners that were very angry since they relied on imports. We talked about that about the South. They were most of the time cheaper, so they bought those goods. Instead, this huge tax hike on imported goods made it very, very difficult for them to buy those things, and they felt like they're kind of being forced to buy northern goods. This took place a year before Jackson took office, so we see that happening there. The Southerners termed this tariff a tariff of abominations, just saying this disgusting. I cannot believe we would do something like that, and it hurt them a whole lot. John Quincy Adams understood. Remember, he's president during this time period. He understood that, hey, this might not be such a good idea to do this, but he signs it into law anyway, and that pretty much seals the deal with him when it came to a lot of the election stuff, not only because of Jackson and the Jacksonian democracy, but also made a huge divide, saying he's more for the North than he was the South. He's more for the richer people than the common man there. So that's the Tariff of Abominations. Okay, now we're getting into this guy named John C. Calhoun, which was Jackson's vice president for his first term. What happens is that this whole idea of the Tariff of Abominations sparks this thought of what's the difference between states' rights versus the federal government. And so that's a big deal when it comes to federalism. So what powers do the federal government have over the states, and what powers do the states have over the federal government, or do they have instead of the federal government? So the Tariff of Abominations bring up this idea. John C. Calhoun was a very big proponent of states' rights. He believed that the states should be the ones making and calling the shots during this time. He decides to write this thing called the States' Rights Doctrine. So it's very important to understand States' Rights Doctrine. He says, since states had formed the national government, then the states' power should be greater than the federal government. So he says it should be flip-flopped. So federalism, whereas where the federal government's on top and then the states are below, they still share power. He thinks it should be the opposite, that the states should be on top and the federal government should be on the bottom. He believes in stronger state rights and a weaker federal government. Kind of the same kind of idea like Thomas Jefferson had, with the states having more rights than the federal government. And so he writes the State Rights Doctrine and says that the states should have more power than the federal government to determine certain things. He says that the states, because of this, have the right to reject, or what we call nullify, any federal law they thought was unconstitutional. So they felt like, hey, that law is not right. We're going to say it does not matter. Forget it. We're not going to worry about it. And so this sparks a huge debate among people that are state proponents versus having the federal government being a little bit stronger. Like I said, it was controversial at the time. John C. Calhoun pretty much wanted the states to be the ones that were running the government. And so northern states, of course, did not like this That's where we had that divide, right? We had the difference between the South and the North, and this whole idea of states' rights becomes a big part when we get further down the line into causes of the Civil War. The northern states, though, believe that the Union was the group of people, not individual states. So the states are not the Union, the people are the Union. And so that's kind of their kind of thought process through this whole endeavor when we talk about the states' rights versus federal government. The supporters and opponents of the doctrine got more and more heated. We have more and more people getting upset about it. And it grew to a dispute known as the Nullification Crisis. And this is something that Jackson has to deal with during his time in office. And so Nullification Crisis is what this whole debate between state rights versus federal government, and that they can nullify, the state governments can nullify any federal law they felt was unconstitutional. So this creates the Nullification Crisis. So this was a big topic in the federal government, especially in the Senate. We have this guy right here named Daniel Webster. He's from Massachusetts. And he says, the U.S. was one nation, not a pact among independent states. A pact among independent states, what he's saying, is a confederacy, right? And we talk about the difference between a federal government and a confederacy. Federal government is one blanket government and then smaller state governments. A confederacy at this time would be a bunch of independent states forming a weaker federal government. He says that's not what the United States is. It is one nation made up by the people, not by independent states. Jackson opposed nullification. He did not think that states had the rights to do that, but he was concerned because the economy in the southern states was very important at this time. The cash crops were cotton and tobacco, two big things that were being sent out among the world and being used in the north, and he was worried that this would really cripple their economy. Jackson asked Congress to pass another tariff that lowered the previous one, saying, all right, we're going to get rid of that really high tariff that was called the Tariff of Abominations, and we're going to lower that. South Carolina, which is where John C. Calhoun is from, believes, hey, that's not enough. We need to get rid of it altogether. It should not be a tariff at all. And so the Nullification Act in South Carolina is rejected. And so they nullify, right? So they say that we're passing the Nullification Act, which says we're going to reject all tariffs. You don't have to worry about a single one of those. Jackson gets very upset by this. He says, I'm not going to deal with this too well. And he would use the army if necessary if they did not follow the federal law. And so remember, we saw this precedent set by Washington with the Whiskey Rebellion, where he said he would march an army there, and he actually did. He marches an army into the North with the Whiskey Rebellion and kind of thwarts that. Jackson uses the same threat, saying, you do not follow the federal law, then you are going to have to deal with the army. So same kind of thing, right? So tariffs on those things, taxes, all a big thing. They're same kind of similarities between the Whiskey Rebellion and this tariff. Henry Clay, once again, the hero compromiser, comes in and says, hey, let's come up with a compromise. Let's do this. Congress, why don't we lower the tariff over several years? Okay, so we'll start down every year. We'll take it down further and further and further. That being said, South Carolina would enforce the law. Okay, so they say if the tariff is lowered, we will South Carolina should enforce law. That compromise is allowed. They agree upon it, and we see the Nullification Crisis kind of smooth out just a little bit there. This whole idea of states' rights, though, become a big thing when we get further and further into whether you should be a slave state or a free state, and that state rights idea comes up again during that time. So we just have these two quotes from Daniel Webster. It says, while the Union lasts, we have high, exciting, gratifying prospects spread out before us and our children. God grant that in my day my eyes shall be turned to behold the gorgeous ensign of the Republic, bearing for its motto liberty and union, now and forever one and inseparable. So he's kind of talking there about how the Union is the group of people, not the states. John C. Calhoun, on the other hand, says, if there be no productive power in the reserved rights of the states, there must be, in the end, be forced to rebel. So he's saying if the power that the states have are not protected for the states, then the best way to do that is to rebel against that thought process. Okay, and that's kind of what we go there with that question. So how did the views of Calhoun Webster differ? Calhoun believed that the states had the rights to reject anything. They could rebel against those thoughts of the federal government. Daniel Webster said the Union is the important people, not the states. That's the key difference between Webster and Calhoun at that moment. So that's the nullification crisis there. Another big part of Jackson is the U.S. Bank. So the U.S. Bank, the second one was created in 1816. So this is before Jackson becomes president. So just keep that in mind as we go along. It's given a 20-year charter. And so that's a key thing to remember there. So a charter is like giving a person, allowing them to be a bank. That's what that is right there, a charter. So, or giving them permission to do certain things. In this second U.S. bank, it had the power to act as the sole financial agent for the federal government. So what that means is that they made all the decisions, whether that be loans or how things are sent out or aid or anything like that. That was up to the bank itself. For the federal government. The states had no authority over that. Many people opposed the bank, okay, mostly southern states, all right, and then they had a good idea, as they said that, these smaller farmers that live in the South, it only helped the wealthy business people, right? They really couldn't get loans from the U.S. Bank because they were smaller farmers. They really couldn't show that they could do those things. So they felt like it helped the smaller people. That goes into when we talked about earlier about the Jacksonian democracy and that thought process there. Jackson also questioned the power of the bank. He felt like it had a little too much power, and felt like the bank was unconstitutional. It plays a role when we get later on down about the whole idea of should the bank stay or not. But they felt like it was unconstitutional that the bank should have all that power over money for the federal government. They felt like it should be a little bit more balanced there. So the whole idea that the states should have the power to control the banks, not Congress, plays a role as we go further along. So the states take action against the national bank. Once again, state rights versus federal government. There's a whole idea again cropping up. Maryland tries to pass a tax that would limit the U.S. bank, saying, you have to pay a certain tax to operate in our states. James McCulloch refuses to pay the tax, who is the head of the branch of the U.S. Bank in Maryland. And so you have McCulloch versus Maryland happening, where he refuses. The state takes him to court and actually reaches the U.S. Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land, which is key to understand because once you get there, whatever they say is what goes, and that's the big part there. So the court rules that the National Bank was constitutional. Remember, the Supreme Court, the judicial branch of our government, interprets laws whether they are constitutional or unconstitutional. So the charter of the U.S. Bank, in the eyes of the Supreme Court, was constitutional. That's a key thing to remember with McCulloch versus Maryland, is that they believed that the Supreme Court ruled the National Bank was constitutional. In 1832, which is right in the middle of Jackson's presidency, they try to renew the charter. 20 years later, they're going to have to renew it. Jackson vetoes the charter. So remember, the legislative branch determines the laws. They make the laws. They make the charter. They send it to Jackson. He vetoes it. And if a law is vetoed, the 2/3 of Congress has to approve it again in order for it to become a law. That's kind of like the final check and balance between those two branches. Congress cannot get 2/3 majority after Jackson vetoes it. Therefore, the U.S. Bank is now gone. So that power there. So he uses his veto power to make sure that the U.S. Bank doesn't exist. So second U.S. Bank is the last one we have there. Now let's get into the dark side of Andrew Jackson and kind of his thought and ideas towards Native Americans. Native Americans have a very big impact on this time period, and they were impacted a whole lot by Jackson. And we're going to kind of talk about what happens, which is a very, very big, dark, terrible part of Jackson's presidency. Jackson and others in the South wanted settlement of land, mostly in Georgia to Mississippi. So you see our map there, Georgia and Mississippi. Uh, they wanted that land, very fertile land, good for farming, and they wanted it so they could um, uh, kind of help the economy in the South. The issue with that was that was Native American land. Okay, that's kind of where a lot of the Native Americans, their ancestors lived, those kind of things, which caused a kind of divide there. Jackson did not think kindly of Native Americans, and he wanted that territory for the United States, and so he pressures Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act in 1830. Okay, so that's the first part of this whole thing. What this does is authorizes the removal of Native Americans who lived east of the Mississippi to the land's west. So it literally forces people that have lived there for who knows how long to move to the west that they're not familiar with. And so this is a forced migration happening right within the borders of the United States. With this Indian Removal Act 2, they established the Indian Territory, which, if you look on our map, becomes present-day Oklahoma. So that's where the Oregon Territory is. So if you think about a lot of the Native Americans, where they reside now, a lot of that west and even further west, like New Mexico, Arizona, Oklahoma, those areas, all that is Native American territory because of the Indian Removal Act. So Jackson pressures Congress to pass that in 1830. Like I said, modern day Oklahoma is where the Indian Territory is. So also what happens is that we have the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It's there to manage the removal of Native Americans from their land, so making sure that they are actually being moved out of those territories and put into the Indian Territory there. The Choctaw are the first Native Americans sent to the Indian Territory. They were sent from the northern part of this area, and they go through and they're forced into this new territory. The Cherokee resist against this forced migration. They sue the state of Georgia, stating that they were an independent nation, that their laws, the state laws, the federal laws do not apply to our territory because we are independent from the United States. Georgia also had no legal power to forcibly remove them. This goes to court, and so we have another court case that we need to know, which is Worcester versus Georgia. So you have Sam Worcester there, and he's the one that goes to court. He was arrested a bunch of times for not leaving or helping people stay, those kind of things. So Worcester versus Georgia says, the court says this, is that the Cherokee Nation was independent and Georgia laws had no force. So that's a big deal that the court says that the Cherokee Nation was independent. They do not have to follow any Georgian or federal laws when it comes to that. Georgia says, I don't care, and we're not gonna follow that. We're gonna force these people out of there. And Andrew Jackson doesn't stop them. Okay, he does not enforce the federal law there. He says that John Marshall has made his decision. Now let them enforce it. So he's kind of just saying, I'm not going to deal with it. Let them deal with it. And it was really a sad thing to see as a president, to just say, I'm not going to deal with that at all. And so you see them kind of being forced out. And that leads us to what we call the Trail of Tears, which is one of the saddest moments in Native American history. When we talk about, like, with contact with settlers in the United States. So the Trail of Tears, it happens during the spring of 1838. U.S. troops began to move the Cherokee to the Indian Territory. So that's when we start having that. We have literally U.S. troops forcing people out of their lands into a new territory just because they want it. When that was happening, literally Georgia people, they came in and took over the businesses, farms, and property. Everything was set up for them. Like, here you go. All this land, all this businesses already ready for you. All you got to do is move in and you're set, which is pretty crappy, to say the least. So the Cherokee are forced to march 800 miles and that's what we call the Trail of Tears, right? So they're forced from Georgia all the way to the Indian Territory, which is modern day Oklahoma. 800 miles. Just think about walking 800 miles out of your homeland and forced migration to a new place that you've never known. That's kind of crazy to think about. Almost a quarter of the 18,000 Cherokee died on the march. Okay, a quarter of the population that was forced out of their territory died on this trip. Okay, a quarter. It's 25%. It's insane to think about, just because they wanted that land for farming. It's really, really dark, sad part of Jackson's presidency. There, you got a lot of disease, right? So on the trails, not a lot of hospitals, those kind of things. Hunger was a big part of it as well, right? Not a lot of food as they're marching through. I'm sure they're not had a whole lot of things with them. And harsh weather, right? Hot summer, being forced through there, really cold winters, it takes a toll on your body as you go through there. So we have these things here. So we have a couple of questions there. We talk about some of these letters, how people felt. And it's really one of those things that Jackson, and we talk about debates about Jackson, when he's a hero or a villain. You actually guys will do that later on in a project. Jackson does a lot of good things when it came to stuff with the expansion of democracy before he became president, bringing more people in to vote, more voting rights for people, not everybody, but owning land was dropped in most states because of him. You have him keeping the country together through the Nullification Crisis and the Tariff of Abominations. So that's a big thing. He ruled over the second U.S. bank, debating whether banks were constitutional or not. But then you had this really, really bad period with Andrew Jackson, with the forcible removal of a group of Native Americans, actually all Native Americans that are in the South, and forcing them to move somewhere else. And so Jackson is a very, what we call, polarizing figure, because there was a lot of things that he did well, there was a lot of things that he did that were bad, and a lot of people see him as a hero, and a lot of people see him as a villain. It's just all about perspective there. And us as historians, while we're here, is go back and look at the whole picture of everything. And you can't take the good without the bad. You can't take the bad without the good. And that's one thing, the key thing to remember from Jackson, is that he did a lot of bad. He did quite some good things, keeping the country together. But when it came to Native Americans, it was not good. There's nothing good you can say about it. All right. So that is all for me. I hope you all get a lot of this. If you go back through the video, just go back through the video. And I'll see y'all later. See ya.